All the Young Dudes, Sirius's Perspective by Rollercosterwords. Chapter 16, First Year, Astronomy. It was nearing the end of February when Sirius finally managed to crack the code. Well, crack might be a bit of a stretch, as he wasn't exactly sure what made Remus decide to join them. But he had managed to find a prank that the other boy was willing to be a part of, and he felt almost giddy as they crowded under the cloak and made their way to the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom. "Good to have you back, Lupin," Sirius said, once they were safely reached their destination. "What do you mean?" Remus asked, eyes on James, who was scaling the ladder in the corner. Their goal was a cage of pixies on the highest shelf, which Sirius had noticed earlier that week in one of their classes. "I haven't been anywhere." "Oh, come on, mate," Peter said, holding the ladder steady. "It hasn't escaped our notice that you've been avoiding us like the plague." Sometimes Peter's tactfulness came in handy. "I haven't," Remus frowned defensively. "Just been busy, studying and stuff." "Well, I hope you're over that phase now," James said cheerily, clutching the cage in both hands as he navigated slowly back down the ladder. "I'd really appreciate it if you stopped working so hard. It makes me have to work harder, you see, and I'm not used to the competition." "Oh, do one, Potter." Sirius rolled his eyes, rummaging through some of the desks to keep busy. He beat Potter half the time in classes, and they both knew it. Remus seemed ready to change the subject, crouching down and gazing at the little blue pixies. "How are we going to get them into the dining hall?" The creatures were sleeping right now, curled up in the bottom of the cage. "Under the cloak," James said, spreading it with a flourish so that they could crowd back under. "Come on, Sirius." Sirius was on his hands and knees, double-checking under the teacher's desk to make sure there wasn't any hidden levers or switches. "What are you looking for?" Peter asked, muffled under the cloak. "One of the Ravenclaws told me there was a trap door under here," Sirius said, sighing when the search failed to reveal any incriminating secret passage and entryways. He dusted off his knees, frowning. "Liar." "This is Black's newest obsession," James explained for Remus's benefit, pinching the cloak closed over their heads. "Finding secret doors." "Hogwarts history says there are loads of undiscovered passages," Sirius insisted. "Like the one you found, Lupin. There's definitely more. I want to find at least one before I leave." "There's also supposed to be a monster hidden somewhere in the castle," James whispered back, as they made their way along the hall towards the Gryffindor Tower. Peter shivered. "A risk I am willing to accept," Sirius declared, although he had to make his declaration in a whisper. "My legacy is much more important." "Typical," James laughed. The cloak worked like a charm. They managed to get their cage of pixies undetected into the great hall, arriving early so that there would be fewer students. James levitated the cage carefully under the table as they all sat down, buzzing with barely contained excitement. Peter, who was good at astronomy, began checking over their homework, which was just busy work. They were all supposed to label every star on their chart. Sirius had looked it over half-heartedly before filling in any names he remembered with whichever star, knowing that Peter would fix them all for him later. Besides, when it actually came time for the test, it would only take 30 minutes of studying to actually remember the correct names. Still, it meant that his homework was in a sorry state. Peter sighed, scribbling out something and saying, "Honestly, you think you'd get your own bloody star right?" Sirius just laughed, shrugging. "What can I say? I'm hopeless." "You have your own star?" Remus asked, frowning. Apparently, although he spent most of every waking minute studying, astronomy was not one of the subjects he dedicated time to. "Sirius," Peter replied. "Come on, Lupin, we've done this. It's the brightest star in the sky. The dog star?" He gave a long, suffering sigh, although Sirius was pretty sure that he had actually enjoyed being the best at something for once. Glancing down at Remus's homework, Peter shook his head. "Yep, you've missed it too." Remus shrugged. "I saw it was a name." "The noble and most ancient house of Black has always been a bit arsy with its naming conventions," Sirius mused. "Half of us have astronomical names. There's Bellatrix, of course, and my dad's Orion, my brother's Regulus. Mum isn't a star. I think she's an asteroid. Pretty apt if you've ever seen her in a bad mood. Then there's good old Uncle Alfred. Uncle Sigmus? Andromeda is named after a whole galaxy. Wizards are so weird, Remus sighed. Remus, James raised an eyebrow, snickering. You know that Lupin is a constellation too, don't you? The wolf. The what? Remus yelped, coughing a bit on his dinner. Sirius's heart stuttered. During the last full moon, he'd managed to distract James and Peter from the fact of Remus's absence with a nighttime exploration mission around the castle. But really, he'd think Remus would be much more subtle about his secret. Sirius actually had no idea how long he'd been a werewolf. If he was a werewolf, which he definitely was. Sirius slapped his friend on the back, changing the subject quickly. If you're nearly finished telling us how stupid we are, Pete, can we get on releasing the you-know-whats? My lovely cousins have just sat down and started eating. I'd call that perfect timing. The others agreed, and James gave the cage a sharp kick to wake the pixies up before whipping the cloak off and whispering a quick unlocking charm. The creatures burst out immediately, an explosion of bright blue chaos. Sirius had heard plenty of stories about how annoying the pixies could be. His aunt had once had a particularly nasty infestation in her garden shed, and it had taken 2 magical pest removers from the Ministries of Magic's Medical Centers Department to safely get rid of them. Now, Sirius could see why. They burst out from under the table, scattering in every direction, and jabbering incessantly in their squeaking, high-pitched voices as they zipped around the hall. They dove into soup tureens, grabbed forks from students' hands, and wielded them like tridents, ripped up some homework, and tugged at students' hair and robes. Quick! James ducked under the table, and they all followed suit. Once they had crouched down, he pulled the invisibility cloak over the group so that they could safely watch the anarchy unravel around them. Brilliant, Sirius said, repeatedly grinning at the chaos. Come on, we must nudge them forward, ever the protagonist. They needed to make sure they snuck out of the hall unnoticed if they wanted to avoid being caught. It was an awkward bit of navigation to get out from under the table, but they managed, despite students diving for cover left and right around them. At least they didn't need to worry about the pixies. The invisibility cloak kept them unseen and unbothered. Even without the cloak, Sirius thought they might have been able to sneak out unnoticed in the uproar. All throughout the hall, boys and girls were screaming and shouting, trying to dodge pixies or else wrestling with the surprisingly strong little beasts for their stolen items. Sirius looked over to the Slytherin table and burst out in excited laughter. Oh, yes! He crowed, gasping. An entire group of pixies had descended onto Bellatrix, yanking her wild hair in every direction. One had even stolen her wand and was now waving at her, shooting sparks of blue lightning. Get off me, you filthy, you disgusting, you are! She wailed. Her sister was hiding under the table, clutching her own wand in both hands. Just before they made it to the door, Peeves the poltergeist whisked in, creating even more mayhem. He zoomed through the room of pixies, cackling and guiding them towards the hiding students. Under here, pixies! Lots of ickle firsties down here! Barely able to contain their laughter, the Marauders fled from the room when they heard McGonagall's shrill voice ring out, Petrificus totalis! She definitely knows it was us, Peter wheezed as they made their way back to the tower. Nah, James replied casually. I bet she blames the Pruitts. They're always off doing stuff like that. Something to aspire to. Please, Sirius begged. Remus shook his head, exasperated. No. Please. No. Why not? It would just feel weird. I don't want you to. But it'll be fun. I promise you'll enjoy it. Ha ha. The conversation had carried on much the same way for about 3 corridors now. Remus, as stubborn as ever, tried to hurry ahead. Next to him, James chastised. Leave Lupin alone, will you? I will not! This is too important. Remus was too pig-headed to let anyone do anything nice for him, but Sirius was determined anyway. He'd gotten the idea after a long study session in the library, where they'd spent all afternoon completing zodiac charts for the astronomy revision. Even though exams still weren't for ages, James had wanted to get a head start, and Sirius wanted to make sure that he got the highest scores. Peter followed them, as usual, and since they were all going, Remus came along too. He seemed to be past his cold shoulder phase. Frustratingly, Sirius still wasn't quite sure what had brought it on, or what had ended it, which made it even more difficult to figure out how to stop it from happening again. But as they'd been musing over their star signs, inspiration struck. It came up that Remus was a Pisces, which meant his birthday was just around the corner. Privately, Sirius had been wondering whether Lupin's withdrawal, at least in the past, was because he felt like a bit of an outsider amongst them. Peter had gotten better about his comments, and Sirius thought that after Christmas break their friendship had been solid. But still, it was hard to know with Remus, and throwing a birthday party would be an excellent way to show his friend how important he was to the Marauders. "It's obviously not important to Remus," James insisted. "Do something for my birthday if you have to. It's not long after." "You'll get your turn," Sirius said dismissively. "But first, Lupin." "I really don't care, Sirius," Remus sighed as they reached the portrait hole of the fat lady. "Don't make a fuss." "But it's your birthday," Sirius reiterated. "We should make a fuss." After all, that was the point of birthdays, wasn't it? They were the day that your friends and family showed you how much they cared about you. Sirius knew what it was like to have a birthday go uncelebrated. His 9th, but he didn't want to think about that. And it wasn't fun. In fact, this year's birthday had been the first one that he had truly enjoyed. It had been wonderful, having all his friends fawn over him for the day. It had made him feel special, wanted, and good. "Why does it matter so much?" Remus snapped, shoulders hunching up as he climbed into the common room. Sirius paused, stung by the irritation in his friend's tone. Had he misread? Was he only upsetting Remus more? For a moment, he was at a loss for words, but Remus turned to face him expectantly, so he did his best to explain. "You did a lot of stuff for my birthday, and, well, it was really nice. I've never much looked forward to it before, but, well, it was great, wasn't it?" Remus blinked, as if this wasn't the answer he'd been expecting. He held his ground for a moment, but then his face softened, and he sighed, and Sirius knew he'd won. "Oh, okay, fine. But not a big party or anything. Just Marauders, all right?" "Right," Sirius agreed, elated, mind already spinning with ideas. Chapter 17. First Year, 12. There was plenty to do in preparation for Remus's birthday, even without throwing a big party. Sirius had to bribe a third-year Hufflepuff into showing him where the kitchens were so that he could give the house elves a very detailed request, and he spent a week tracking down every Gryffindor, even the 7th years, to sign a joint birthday card. The most time-consuming part, though, was trying to talk James out of forcing them to watch the Gryffindor Quidditch practice after lessons. Sirius liked Quidditch, loved it even, but James was obsessed with it. Every Friday, he dragged his friends down to the pitch to watch the older students darting around on their brooms. Sirius didn't mind it much. He liked spending time with James, and it was relaxing to just lean back in the stands and chat, but he didn't think Remus enjoyed it as much as the rest of them. He always had his nose stuck in a book, so when Sirius discovered that, although their friend's birthday fell on a Friday, James didn't see any reason to change their usual plan, he'd had to give a very stern conversation and put his foot down. When the big day finally arrived, Sirius and James woke up at the crack of dawn, dragging Peter out of bed. They waited until the sun was just rising before crowding around Lupin. Sirius held up his fingers, mouthing, 1, 2, 3. "Happy birthday, Lupin!" they shouted, leaping onto his bed. Remus woke with a start, sitting up quickly. He smiled at them, yawning as he said, "Cheers, lads." They gave him the full treatment at breakfast, marching in front of him and shooing other students away, blustering. "Out of the way, please. Birthday boy coming through. Move along. Nothing to see here." Some older students rolled their eyes, but most seemed to find their antics entertaining. It was almost the weekend, and everybody was in a good mood. At the table, they slapped Remus's hands away as he reached for the food, insisting on serving him. Peter poured his tea, James loaded up his plate, and Sirius buttered his toast. Remus looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. "Do you have to?" he groaned, burying his face in his hands. "Oh, absolutely," James said. "Definitely," Peter nodded. "Unquestionably," finished Sirius. Remus shook his head, blushing hard, but he was smiling as he looked down at his food. As soon as they'd finished eating, Sirius nodded at Peter and James. The three of them stood in unison, grinning at their anxious friend. "What?" he asked, eyes darting around nervously. He tried to stand, but Peter and James each had a hand on his shoulder, pushing him back down into his seat. Sirius pulled a pitch pipe from his robes with a flourish, smiling wickedly as he blew a note. Remus shut his eyes, bracing himself. "Happy birthday to you," they bellowed as loud as they could. "Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Remus." At their eager and slightly pitchy, despite the pipe, serenade, the rest of the hall began to join in, and Remus covered his head with his hands. "Happy birthday to you." James leapt onto his chair. "Hip, hip! Hooray!" the Gryffindors cheered. The entire table was laughing as James stepped back down, and although Remus continued to groan, he had a reluctant smile on his face. Unfortunately, Sirius couldn't cancel classes, and they still had potions as their final lesson of the week. Tromping down to the dungeons had left a bad taste in the back of his mouth that was only made worse by seeing Snape. He narrowed his beady eyes at them, glaring through lank curtains of greasy hair, but he didn't say anything. He'd been avoiding them, mostly, since the rain prank, which made Sirius think he must have learned his lesson about messing with the Marauders. Slughorn droned on endlessly about the 5 key components to sleeping draughts, and Sirius had to keep flicking Remus's elbow to stop him dozing off. It was a dreary end to the week, especially when the old professor refused to hear any of James's and Sirius's protests that they shouldn't have homework on account of it being the holiday. Luckily, they were able to pick things up again at dinner, where they performed their loudest rendition yet of Happy Birthday. Even Dumbledore joined in, conducting the entire school until everyone was bellowing at the top of their lungs. Sirius presented the joint card from Gryffindor, and Remus grinned at each name. Back in the common room, Sirius brought his beloved record player down and stuck on Electric Warrior. He had memorized all the words at this point, and was glad for an excuse to force James and Peter to listen. Mark Bolan's melancholy voice crooned through the speaker.
I was dancing when I was 12. I was dancing when I was 12.
Sirius caught Remus's eye, smiling. The cake was the pièce de la résistance, beautifully decorated in red and gold Gryffindor icing, and sporting 12 pink candles. "Make a wish," they cheered. Remus blew out the candles with one strong breath. When he went to cut the cake, his eyes widened in surprise. It was composed of 4 different flavours: a quarter chocolate, a quarter lemon drizzle, a quarter Victoria sponge, and a quarter coffee and walnut. Sirius had given very specific instructions to the house elves. "Like your toast," he explained giddily, thrilled at the results of his efforts. "Thought you might get bored if it was all one flavour." "Wow, thanks." Remus raised his fork happily in acknowledgement, digging in. "So what do you want to do for the rest of the evening?" James asked innocently. "It looks light enough if you did want to go watch the—" "He doesn't, James. Bloody hell, you're going to have to start developing some other interests, mate. You're getting boring." "I don't mind if you want to go watch the Quidditch practice," Remus said hurriedly. "You've already done plenty, honestly. 3 songs in one day. What more could a 12-year-old ask for?" James looked torn for a moment, but then briefly shook his head. "No, Sirius is right. It's your birthday. We'll do something you like doing." They fell silent, and there was an awkward pause before James cleared his throat. Lupin, what do you like doing?" Remus frowned, lips sticking out as he thought. Sirius waited, wondering what his friend might say. He knew that Remus liked listening to music and eating, but they'd already done that. When they were all together, the Marauders were usually involved in either mischief-making or, when absolutely necessary, studying, so neither of those felt specific to Remus. All the other boys had their own hobbies. Peter's was chess, James' Quidditch, and Sirius bounced from project to project, but he still didn't know what Remus got up to. even though he wandered off on his own quite a bit. "Reading?" Peter suggested. "You read a lot." "Do I?" Remus blinked, as though he hadn't realised it was true, but ever since Christmas it had been almost impossible to find him without a book in hand. "Oh, yeah, great." James rolled his eyes. "Happy birthday, Lupin. Let's start a book club." Sirius sniggered. Pete looked annoyed. "What I don't know. Other than reading, you seem to really like detention, Remus." Sirius rolled his eyes, frustrated with Peter. Remus hadn't got detention since their prank on Snape. He'd transformed himself into a complete swat. But Remus just laughed apologetically, holding up his hands. "Sorry, lads. I just reckon I'm really boring." "What about when you disappear off?" Sirius pressed, intent. Remus balked. "What do you mean? I told you, I've been sick. I gotta go to hospital wing." The words came out in a rush, and Sirius realised his mistake. He hadn't meant to bring up, well, that. He waved a hand, saying, "No, not then. Sometimes you go off after lessons. Or while we're watching the Quidditch. What are you doing?" This seemed to be a sensitive topic too, by the way Remus was blushing. How many secrets did he have? Regardless, Sirius was determined to get to the bottom of this one. He waited, watching expectantly. "I just sort of walk around," Remus hedged. "Where, though?" Peter asked. "In the grounds?" "Anywhere," he shrugged. "I just like to look about, so I know where stuff is." He reached it into his pocket, pulling out a map. It was the one that had been given to the first years when they'd arrived in the autumn. Sirius had lost his ages ago, and he was surprised that Remus held on to it. "It's stupid. I started adding stuff to the map they gave us at the beginning of the year, and whenever I see something interesting, I put it in." He handed the map off to James, who unfolded it. Peter and Sirius huddled closer, looking down over his shoulder. Sirius was stunned. Each portrait had a small name written underneath, and various staircases and hallways were colour-coded. It was marked with symbols and notes, many of which he couldn't understand, but assumed they must be indicating secret doors or hidden passageways. His pulse kicked with excitement, mind immediately spinning with ideas for how they might use the map to aid the Marauders' missions. Remus was a genius, and he didn't even seem to realise it. He must have put hours of work into this. "You've added all the portraits, and labelled them and everything." "My spelling's rubbish," Remus said bashfully, still blushing. James squinted, pointing to one of the little symbols. "What's that?" One of the trick steps," Remus explained. "That's the one you sink into, that one." He pointed to the mark on a different step. "This one vanishes. The staircase with the arrows are the ones that move. I colour-coded it so you can see where they end up." "Merlin!" Peter exhaled. "Do you have any idea how much time this would save me? I swear I get trapped in the wrong corridor twice a week because of those flipping stairs." "And me," James agreed. "Sod getting to lesson on time." Sirius raised his eyebrows meaningfully. "Try to recognise the extremely important implications of this map. The possibilities now available to us for practical jokes." The smile spread across James's face, then Peter's, but Remus's gaze shuttered. He snatched the map back. "It's not finished yet," he said quickly, folding it back up. "There's loads to do. I wanted to do some spells on it once I figure it out." Sirius wasn't sure how to interpret his sudden edginess. Was he embarrassed at the map's incompleteness? They could all see how much work he'd put into it. "Well, what sort of spells?" he asked encouragingly, hoping to emphasise that they all thought the map was absolutely brilliant. Remus hesitated. Again, Sirius was frustrated, trying to understand what his friend's wariness was about. Was he shy? Insecure? Did he resent Sirius? Did he accidentally force Remus to share a secret that he didn't want to share? But he'd seemed excited to explain all his symbols. "Just some improvements." Lupin's voice was stilted. "You'll think it's silly." "No, we won't," Peter assured him, earnest. "We can help." "I suppose. It's my map, though." Is that what this is about? Sirius thought Remus was being silly. Obviously, he was the only one creative enough to come up with this. The map had Remus's own personal brand of genius stamped all over it. "Of course it's yours," James spoke soothingly. "Like the cloak is mine, right? But in the service of mischief." "It's the Marauders," Sirius finished, leaning forward. The Marauder's map, Remus echoed, still looking a bit sceptical. Sirius rushed to reassure him. It's all yours, Lupin. We'll put your name first and everything. Not sure if we want our names on it, Peter mumbled nervously. Or nicknames, then, Sirius accepted. We don't have nicknames, Remus pointed out, musing. Well, I suppose I sort of do, but I really don't want Loony Lupin written on it. They burst out laughing, and Remus grinned, tension bleeding away. When they had calmed down, he unfolded the map shyly, pointing out an area on the 3rd floor that he hadn't had time to catalogue yet. Armed with the invisibility cloak, they spent the rest of the evening roaming unseen through the halls. They were getting better at shuffling around together under the cloak, and though it was a bit awkward, Sirius made it worth their while. He smuggled out 5 dung bombs, which provided great entertainment on the route through the castle. It was especially fun to creep up and leave them behind snogging couples, and Peter managed to get one in the pocket of a bedraggled 7th year that was hurrying to the library. As they walked, Remus showed them everything he'd worked out so far, pointing out all the passageways and the shortcuts he'd discovered, along with a few hidden corners and rooms. Sirius listened with a mix of awe and jealousy. A full month of searching. He hadn't been able to find one hidden door. Remus had 6 marked on his map. He even told them about his plan to try and put a tracking spell on Mrs. Norris, the cat that belonged to the horrible caretaker, Filch. With a spell, they would be able to see her coming on the map and steer clear. She had some sort of uncanny ability to communicate with her master, and he always showed up not long after to spoil any fun being had. Why stop here? Sirius whispered eagerly. Why not track everyone? They were on their way back to the common room, rounding the corner that led to the fat lady's portrait. Everyone? Yeah, then we'd know when anyone was coming. We could get away with anything. No more Peter complaining while he kept watch. It would be brilliant. But Remus didn't seem as enthusiastic, mumbling, I don't know. Again, there was that wary look in his eyes. Sirius wondered what he was hung up on this time. Luckily, James and Peter both agreed wholeheartedly with this idea, pointing out that he'd be able to see what Dumbledore was up to, or where Snape was lurking. Sirius was sure that whatever it was that was bothering Remus, they'd be able to bring him round. Then it was only a matter of finding the right spell, and with everything he'd already accomplished, he was sure they could manage that. Chapter 18. First Year Revision. James's birthday came only a few weeks later, and although their peers seemed to have less tolerance for another round of the Marauders' rodeo antics, no one could begrudge Gryffindor's golden boy a bit of a birthday celebration. His cheery confidence and reputation as de facto leader of the Marauders had already made Potter something of a celebrity to the first years, and even amongst most of the older students he was well liked for his sense of humour and impressive knack with magic. With anyone else, the popularity might have gone to their head, but although James certainly had an ego, its growth seemed only to bolster his acute sense of right and wrong. What he lacked in humility, he made up for with genuine kindness and an eagerness to help others. So although twice in 1 month was a bit much, they still managed to get most of the dining hall singing during their repeated renditions of Happy Birthday, and Sirius finangled another hour on the Quidditch pitch with some of the current Gryffindor team members. James was so thrilled, you'd have thought he'd been invited to play in the league itself. As March drew to a close, however, Sirius found himself occupied with something much duller than party planning. Exams. The entire school whipped into a frenzy, and you couldn't find a single corner of the castle where there wasn't a student frantically revising. James threw himself into revision with the steady determination that he applied to any endeavour, which of course meant that Sirius had to buckle down as well. He didn't much care if James surpassed him when it came to homework assignments, but exams were another thing entirely. Sirius delighted in turning their revision into a competition, making bets with James about who could get the top marks. Remus tagged along for their study sessions, but refused to be swept up into any contests. Unlike most of the student body, he didn't seem to feel any pressure at all when it came to his grades, apparently satisfied with his ability to simply pass his classes. Sirius thought privately that Remus might be able to give both him and James a run for their money if he applied himself a bit more. But he wasn't about to push his friend to study more now that he was finally easing up on the swap phase that had taken up so much of his time. Peter, on the other hand, was under quite a bit of pressure. Since his sister had run off to Muggle College, a scandal of epic proportions in the wizarding community, it was apparently up to him to carry the family legacy. From what Sirius understood, Peter's parents were social climbers who felt strongly that their blood status should count for more than it did, although they of course would never say so directly. Unfortunately, what the Pettigrews boasted in blood purity, they lacked in power, which often left them on the fringes of high society. Sirius might have felt bad for him, except he thought the scrambling of social climbers in wizarding circles was ridiculous, and he didn't understand why Peter tried so hard to please his parents. Having always been at the top of the wizarding food chain, Sirius didn't think it was all that it was cracked up to be. He didn't much care to try and understand why someone else might. Also, Peter was incredibly annoying about the whole thing. "How much do we need to pass this year?" he asked desperately, at least 4 times a day. "Peter, calm down," James would soothe. "You're going to be fine. You know all the theory backwards now. It's just putting it into practice." Sirius refrained from rolling his eyes, but once the others were out of earshot, he leaned over to whisper to Remus, "I don't blame him for being a bit twitchy. There've been at least 12 squibs in the Pettigrew family, and that's just in this century." "Squibs? Non-magical wizards," Sirius clarified. "You know how Muggle families sometimes have magical kids? It works the other way too. No one likes to talk about it much. My great-great-uncle actually had this mad theory that Muggles were swapping their children out for ours so that they could infiltrate the wizarding world. Complete bonkers, obviously." "Right," Remus said slowly, processing. "So that's why Peter's magic is a bit wonky." This was a nice way of saying what was painfully obvious, that Peter was leagues behind the rest of the Marauders when it came to spellcasting. He struggled to perform magic that the others could do without thinking. "I dunno," Sirius shrugged. "Maybe. I don't know if they can actually prove that squibbishness runs in families. But it's the reason the Pettigrews aren't in the Sacred 28. Remus gave him an exasperated sigh, fixing Sirius with a withering look. "You know, I don't know what that is." Sirius did, but he liked it when Remus asked him things. He poked the other boy's side, smirking. "I don't know, Lupin. With all that reading you do these days, nice to know there's some things I've still got over you." Remus snorted and looked back down at his work, clearly unwilling to give Sirius the satisfaction of actually voicing his question. Hoping to hold his friend's attention, Sirius quickly continued. "The Sacred 28 are the purest of purebloods, the last remaining untainted families." Remus shot him another glare, as if this was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard in his life. Sirius held up his hands, hurrying to explain, "Their words, not mine. You know I don't believe in any of that blood purity rubbish." "Right." Remus raised an eyebrow. "But the blacks are at the top of the list, though." A smirk curled at the corner of Sirius's lips. "Actually," he said, "the abbots are first. It's alphabetical." Remus groaned and turned back to his book, but Sirius caught the twitch of a smile on his face. Aside from his ongoing competition with James, Sirius had another reason for throwing himself into revision. As long as he focused all his energy on his exams, he didn't have time to think about what came after exams. Summer vacation. While other students could be heard chattering about holiday plans and family reunions, Sirius only scowled any time the subject of summer came up. He preferred to think about it as little as possible, even as it became harder and harder to ignore. He hadn't spoken to Regulus since their fight at Christmas, and he no longer had any idea what to expect when he returned home. He thought about trying to write again, maybe even apologizing, but he wasn't sure if his mother would read any of the letters he wrote, and even if he knew all the messages would reach his brother untouched, Sirius couldn't quite bring himself to swallow his pride. He was still upset with Reg for what he viewed as a fundamental betrayal. In Sirius's view, he had sided with their parents when they were always supposed to side with each other. At the same time, his own guilt threatened to chew through him whenever he thought of the scars on his brother's legs, the accusatory way he spat, "Leaving you alone." Sirius couldn't shake the feeling that he'd let his brother down, that he'd abandoned Regulus as much as Reg had abandoned him. Even though neither of them had really had any choice in the matter, it made him feel utterly powerless. Sirius thought about it more and more as summer loomed closer. It was the drain at the centre of his mind, around which all his thoughts swirled. He could keep his mind spinning for as long as possible, but eventually he would be pulled back towards the dark pit. He was entirely grateful for James Potter, who did his best to understand and was always ready with a comforting word on nights that Sirius crawled into his bed, unable to sleep. Sometimes he broke down completely, unable to stop the tears that fought their way out of his eyes. But James was so understanding that he hardly even felt embarrassed, although he could hear his mother's voice in the back of his mind. "Have some dignity! Boys don't cry!" On the night that Sirius revealed his scars, needing desperately to talk about what he'd seen on Reggie's legs over Christmas break, James gasped. "That's evil," he whispered, righteous fury alight in his eyes. Sirius wasn't sure how to process his reaction to the word. He hated what his mother did. Of course, he thought it was awful, terrible, horrible, but he recoiled from the word evil. His first instinct was to become defensive. Everyone disciplined their children, after all. His family was just a bit more extreme than most. "She thinks it's what's best for us," he heard himself say. He realized, with a start, that he was echoing his brother's words. James looked skeptical, so he continued. "It's not... Obviously, I know it's wrong, but it's not like I can stop her. I thought I'd be able to keep her from doing it to Reg. It's not like he was ever as bad as me. He never did anything to really deserve it." "Sirius," James interrupted him, a strange look in his eye. "Nobody deserves that. You don't deserve that. You know that, right?" Sirius wanted to respond, but his throat closed up. "You shouldn't have to go back there," James continued. "It isn't right." His eyes lit up, suddenly with an idea. "Stay with me for the summer." Sirius blinked, reaching to scrub suspiciously at his damp cheeks. "What?" "You can stay with me. I'm sure my parents would love to have you." He was smiling eagerly, clearly excited by the solution. "I can't," Sirius responded, heart sinking. "My family would never let me." James started to speak again, but Sirius shook his head. "Look, just leave it, all right? Let's talk about something else." His friend acquiesced reluctantly, but the next day James brought it up again. They were in the common room, watching Peter try to turn a banana into a slipper. Sirius frowned, sighing. "You know they'll never let me." "Cheer up, mate," James said, slinging an arm around his shoulder. He was unshakably confident that he'd found the solution to Sirius's summer problem, certain he'd be able to make it work. Sirius didn't know how to convince his friend that it simply wasn't possible. "They won't, though. Bellatrix's bloody wedding is in June, and you can bet I'll have to be around for all of it." "We got an invite to that," Peter chimed in, looking up from his work. The banana looked halfway to a slipper now, but it was still bright yellow and unpleasantly squishy looking. "Probably see you there." "Yeah, great," Sirius muttered darkly, unable to muster up any enthusiasm at the thought of Peter attending one of his awful family gatherings. "If I haven't been turned into a newt, or cursed into a portrait for the summer. They actually did that to Andromeda once. She's never been the same. Hates wizarding paintings now." "After the wedding," James said, steering the conversation stubbornly back to his original point. "Then we'll work something out. I'll break you out of there if I have to, I swear. I'll break you out of there if I have to, I swear." Sirius did his best to smile, but not wanting to argue with his friend, James grinned back, and he looked so confident that it was impossible not to feel a small stirring of hope. If anyone could figure out how to smuggle Sirius away from his family, it was James Potter. "You too, Lupin," James threw in. Remus was lying on his stomach on the floor, only half listening. "Hmm?" He lifted his head slightly. Sirius thought he saw a wince as he moved, but his features quickly settled back to a neutral expression. "You should come and stay with me over the summer. Got loads of room, and Mum doesn't mind." "Can't." Remus shook his head, looking back down at his book. He seemed distracted, tense. Sirius wondered what he was thinking about. "Matron won't let me. Legal guardian stuff. Muggle law." "There'll be a way around it," James replied, unable to take no for an answer. "Both of you are coming, right?" "I'm making it happen." Sirius wished that it wasn't so easy to believe him. He didn't know if he'd be able to handle getting his hopes up, only to have them come crashing down once he was actually stuck in his parents' dreary manor again. Luckily, Peter gasped, effectively distracting them from the conversation. I think I've done it. He held his bright yellow slipper aloft. Well done, Pete, Sirius said, not able to quite muster up the enthusiastic encouragement James was so good at procuring. Try it on, see if it fits. Peter leaned down, fitting the slipper onto his foot. As he did, Sirius noticed Remus moving in the corner of his eye, straightening to a sitting position, and then suddenly jumping to his feet. His eyes were wide, as if he'd just had an idea. Ugh! Peter yelped, drawing attention back to himself. His bare foot was now covered in banana slime. James burst out laughing, shaking so hard that his glasses almost slipped off his face. He was joking, Pete. You've got to stop doing stuff just because we tell you to. Remus was still standing, a strange look on his face. You okay, Lupin? Sirius asked, curious. Remus hesitated as the attention turned to him. Yeah? Just think I might go for a walk? Where? It's almost curfew, Sirius asked. He felt a spark of excitement, realizing that Remus was up to something. What are you planning? No, nothing. Just fancied. We'll come! James stood up. I'll get the cloak. No! Remus shouted. They froze, even Peter, who was halfway through picking banana strings from between his toes. I don't feel well. I just want to go to Madame Pomfrey, that's all. Oh. Sirius realized his mistake immediately. He'd been doing his best to keep James and Peter from not noticing all of Remus's strange disappearances, but they had started questioning more and more why their friend was so periodically sick. Sirius tried to avoid calling attention to the matter, but it looked like he'd done the opposite tonight. He cursed himself silently. All right, mate, James said gently, holding his hands out. They'd all gotten used to Remus's sudden mood swings by now. Calm down. Want us to come with you anyway? I'll go, Sirius said quickly. He stood up and took Remus by the elbow before he could protest, steering him towards the portrait hole. Sirius, Remus started, once they were safely out of the empty corridor. Sirius could guess what he was going to say. He likely wouldn't want his friend to go to the hospital wing with him, not if this was werewolf-related. Remus still had no idea that Sirius had figured out his secret. It's all right, Lupin, he quickly assured his friend. I'm just walking you there. I won't go in with you or anything. Remus looked a bit confused, but he seemed to accept this. They started walking, moving more slowly than usual. Sirius realized that Remus was in pain, and trying to hide it. His jaw was clenched, his shoulders stiff with tension. He wondered once more what exactly went on during his friend's monthly transformations. Whatever it was, it always seemed to take something out of him. Are you all right? Sirius asked carefully. You're walking stiffly. Don't feel well, Remus repeated, forcing the words through gritted teeth. Clearly he didn't want to talk about it, but then he never wanted to talk about himself in any context. Sirius knew better than to push. Okay, he replied, nonchalant, as they continued to walk in silence. When they arrived at the hospital wing, there was an awkward pause outside the door. Remus stared him down, glaring defensively as he waited for his friend to leave. Sirius looked back, unruffled. Hope you feel better, he said. Can we come and visit you tomorrow, if you're not out? Remus blinked, as if that wasn't what he'd been expecting. His glare softened a bit, but he's still wary as he muttered, Suppose so, with a shrug that made him wince, definitely in pain. Sirius was careful not to let his expression change. He wished, for a moment, that he could just tell Remus he'd figured it out, that he didn't have to keep this secret, that he could ask for help, that he wasn't alone. But Sirius knew that wasn't a good idea, so he only said, Look after yourself, Lupin, before turning and hurrying off without looking back.